The Arizona sun hammered down like molten copper on the trading post's tin roof, making the air shimmer in waves across the endless stretch of desert. Sarah McKenzie wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve, her calloused hands steady as she restocked the shelves with ammunition and canned goods. 2 years of running this place alone had taught her to keep busy when the loneliness crept in like the desert heat. The trading post sat like a weathered island in an ocean of sand and sagebrush, 20 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Ridge. Its adobe walls, thick enough to stop rifle bullets, enclosed a world of survival essentials: flour sacks stacked against the far wall, barrels of water and salt pork, coils of rope hanging from wooden pegs. Sarah had chosen this isolation after Thomas died in the mine collapse. Too many pitying looks and whispered conversations about poor widow McKenzie had driven her to seek solitude. Here, she dealt mostly with miners, drifters, and the occasional cavalry patrol heading toward the Apache reservations. Her husband's Colt 45 hung heavy on her hip, a constant reminder that out here, trust was a luxury few could afford. The Apache raids had been getting bolder, the newspapers in Tucson filled with stories of burned homesteads and missing settlers. Just last month, the Hendersons' ranch had been hit, their cattle scattered and their barn reduced to ash. Mrs. Henderson had barely escaped with her 3 children, riding bareback through the night with Apache war cries echoing behind them. Sarah paused in her work, something nagging at the edge of her consciousness. The desert had its own rhythm, the whisper of wind through the Joshua trees, the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead, the occasional rattle of stones as a lizard darted between rocks. But this sound was different. It came and went like the desert breeze, faint but persistent. She stepped onto the covered porch, her boots echoing on the weathered planks. The afternoon heat hit her like opening an oven door, dry and merciless. Shading her eyes against the brutal glare, she strained to listen. The cry came again, faint but unmistakably human, high-pitched, desperate. A child's voice carried on the scorching wind from somewhere beyond the ridge to the east. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her revolver. Apache war parties were known to use decoys, sending women or children ahead to lure settlers into ambushes. Captain Morrison had warned her about such tactics during his last patrol through the area. "They're clever devils," he'd said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Don't trust anything that seems helpless out there." But something about this cry made her chest tighten with recognition. It was the sound of pure suffering, the kind that transcended race or culture. She'd heard it before in the winter, when little Emma Peterson caught the fever that took half the children in Cedar Ridge. She grabbed her wide-brimmed hat and the brass spyglass Thomas had given her for their first anniversary, its surface worn smooth by countless desert observations. Climbing onto the woodshed roof, with the agility born of necessity, she trained the lens toward the sound. Through the wavering heat mirages, she could make out 2 figures moving slowly across the desert floor, one tall and lean, carrying the smaller one. The larger figure wore buckskin and moved with the fluid grace she'd learned to associate with Apache warriors. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and even from this distance, she could see the exhaustion in his gait. The smaller figure hung limp in his arms, barely moving. The cry came again, weaker this time, and Sarah felt her resolve crack like dried leather. It was definitely a child. Sick, dying, perhaps. She'd heard that same desperate wail from little Emma Peterson, remembered how the sound had haunted the entire town, until the fever finally claimed her. "Lord help me," she whispered, lowering the spyglass with trembling hands. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door, load the rifle, and wait for whatever was coming to pass her by. The Apache had good reason to hate whites, the broken treaties that pushed them onto barren reservations, the forced marches that separated families, the massacres that newspapers called victories, but which had left deep scars on both peoples. She'd be a fool to trust any of them, especially after what happened to the Murphy family just 6 months ago. But as she climbed down from the roof, the child's cry echoed again across the desert, and Sarah found herself thinking of her own daughter, the one she'd lost in the 3rd month, before Thomas died, before this life of solitude became her refuge from a world that seemed determined to take everything she loved. She checked the loads in her Colt, muscle memory guiding her fingers as she verified each chamber held a bullet. If whoever was out there meant harm, they'd chosen a poor strategy, approaching in broad daylight across open ground with a sick child. More likely, they were exactly what they appeared to be, desperate people in need of help. The sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah shielded her eyes and watched the approaching figures grow larger against the endless expanse of sand and rock. The Apache warrior moved with purpose, but there was something labored about his steps, as if he'd been walking for days without rest. The child in his arms hadn't moved in several minutes, against her better judgment, against everything her neighbors in Cedar Ridge had taught her about Apache savages, against the warnings of every cavalry officer who'd stopped at her trading post. Sarah McKenzie made her choice. She walked to the well behind the building, its rope worn smooth by countless draws, and pulled up a bucket of cool water. The liquid was precious as gold out here, but what good was survival if it cost her soul? Setting the bucket beside her door, she returned to her rocking chair on the porch with Thomas's old Winchester rifle across her lap. The wood was scarred from years of use, the metal darkened by desert sun and careful cleaning. She waited, watching the figures approach through the shimmering heat, knowing that in the next few minutes she would discover whether her compassion would prove to be salvation or the mistake that finally claimed her life. The figures emerged from the heat shimmer like ghosts, materializing from the desert itself. Sarah kept the Winchester steady across her lap, her finger resting lightly on the trigger guard as she watched the Apache warrior approach. He moved with the cautious grace of a man who had learned to expect danger from every shadow, every rock formation, but exhaustion weighed heavy on his shoulders. As he drew closer, Sarah could see the details that distance had obscured. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of someone who lived off the harsh desert. His buckskin clothes were dust-covered and travel-worn, decorated with beadwork that spoke of careful craftsmanship, now dulled by days of hard journey. A knife hung at his belt, but she noticed he made no move toward it. The child in his arms was clearly a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, her small body limp as a rag doll. Her dark hair hung matted with sweat and dust, and even from 20 yards away, Sarah could see the fever flush on her bronze cheeks. The little one's breathing was rapid and shallow, punctuated by weak cries that tore at Sarah's heart. The warrior stopped at the edge of her property, marked by nothing more than a line of rocks Thomas had laid out years ago. He stood there in the blazing sun, swaying slightly on his feet, and Sarah realized he was asking permission to approach. The gesture surprised her. Every story she'd heard painted Apache as savage raiders who took what they wanted by force. "Water," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. His voice was rough with thirst and desperation. "Please, for my daughter." The word daughter hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd expected him to say child or nothing at all, but the familial bond in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a warrior on a raid. This was a father watching his child die. Sarah rose slowly from her chair, keeping the rifle visible but not aimed directly at him. "How long has she been sick?" she asked, studying the little girl's flushed face. 10 days, he replied, taking a half step forward before catching himself. "No food, little water. She burns with fire inside." He paused, his dark eyes meeting Sarah's with raw desperation. "I am Nalnish. This is my daughter, Ayana. We mean no harm." The formal introduction caught Sarah off guard. In all the stories about Apache savagery, no one had mentioned their manners. She glanced around the empty desert, confirming they were alone. If this was a trap, it was an elaborate one involving a genuinely sick child and a father's obvious anguish. "There's water by the door," she said carefully, nodding toward the bucket. "And shade on the porch." Nalnish's shoulders sagged with relief, but he moved forward cautiously, watching Sarah's hands on the rifle. When he reached the bucket, he knelt and gently lowered his daughter to the porch boards. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, dark as midnight and bright with fever. "Biko," she whispered in Apache, then switched to broken English. "Water, please." Sarah felt her defensive walls crumble completely. The child's politeness in the midst of such suffering reminded her painfully of her own lost baby, the one who never had the chance to ask for water or anything else. Setting the rifle aside, she fetched a tin cup from inside the trading post. "Slowly," Sarah said, kneeling beside Nalnish as he helped his daughter drink. "Too much too fast will make her sick." Nalnish nodded, his large hands gentle as he supported Ayana's head. "You know children," he observed, glancing at Sarah with something approaching gratitude. I lost one," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "Long time ago." They worked together in silence for several minutes, getting small sips of water into the fevered child. Sarah found herself studying Nalnish's face, noting the deep lines of worry around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened each time his daughter whimpered. Whatever else he might be, He was clearly a devoted father. "Where are you headed?" Sarah asked, as Ayana finally settled into what appeared to be natural sleep rather than fever-induced unconsciousness. "North," Nalnish replied simply. "To my brother's band. They winter in the mountains where the soldiers do not follow." He paused, then added, "Our band was scattered by the blue coats. Ayana and we got separated from the others." Sarah didn't need him to elaborate. She'd heard about the cavalry sweeps, designed to force Apache bands onto the reservations by destroying their camps and scattering their people. What she'd never considered was the human cost: families torn apart, children lost in the wilderness. "The nearest town is Cedar Ridge," she said carefully. "They have a doctor there." Nalnish shook his head firmly. "White Town. They would hang me, take Ayana." His voice carried bitter certainty. "We cannot go there." Sarah knew he was right. The people of Cedar Ridge lived in constant fear of Apache raids. They would see a warrior and his daughter as threats to be eliminated, not patients to be healed. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very people who might save the child would likely kill her father without a second thought. "How far to your brother's band?" she asked. 3 days, maybe 4 if—" He glanced down at his daughter, and Sarah saw the doubt in his eyes. They both knew Ayana might not survive another day of desert travel, let alone 3 or 4. The afternoon sun had shifted, and the porch now offered blessed shade to the small group. Sarah found herself facing a decision that would define who she truly was. Not the bitter widow hiding from the world, but the woman Thomas had married, the one who believed in doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. "Bring her inside," Sarah said quietly. "I've got medicine, clean water, food." She paused, meeting Nalnish's surprised gaze. "Your daughter needs rest, and you both need to recover your strength." Nalnish stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to understand this unexpected kindness from someone he'd been taught to view as an enemy. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah looked down at the sleeping child, so small and vulnerable in the harsh desert setting. "Because she's somebody's daughter," she said, "and because it's the right thing to do." Inside the trading post, the thick adobe walls provided blessed relief from the desert heat. Sarah cleared a space near the back wall where a small window allowed cross-ventilation, spreading clean blankets over a makeshift bed. Nalnish carried Ayana inside with reverent care, his weathered hands supporting her as if she were made of precious glass. The little girl's fever had worsened during their brief time on the porch. Her skin burned to the touch, and she muttered in Apache between fitful periods of sleep. Sarah had seen enough frontier fevers to know they were racing against time. Children could fade quickly in this merciless climate. "I need to get her clothes off," Sarah said, already reaching for the medicine box Thomas had insisted on keeping well stocked. "The fever needs to break and we need to cool her down." Nalnish hesitated, his protective instincts warring with desperation. In Apache culture, modesty was important, even for children. But as Ayana let out a weak cry, he nodded grimly. "Do what you must." Sarah worked efficiently, her movements gentle but purposeful. She'd helped Doc Peterson in Cedar Ridge during the scarlet fever outbreak 2 winters ago, and the experience served her well now. Ayana's traditional Apache dress was beautifully crafted, but heavy with dust and sweat. Underneath, the child's ribs showed clearly. They'd been without adequate food for far too long. "When did she last eat?" Sarah asked, dampening cloths with cool water from her precious reserve. 2 days, Nalnish admitted, shame coloring his voice. "Maybe 3. I gave her what little we had." He watched Sarah's ministrations with careful attention, noting every technique. "You are skilled, like a medicine woman." Sarah almost smiled at the comparison. "Just experience. Lost too many friends to fever, not to learn a few things." She placed the cool cloths on Ayana's forehead and wrists, checking the pulse points. "The fever's high, but she's strong." While Sarah tended to his daughter, Nalnish stood near the door, alert for any signs of approaching riders. His presence should have made Sarah nervous, but instead she found his vigilance oddly comforting. He was protecting all of them now. "Tell me about her," Sarah said as she mixed a weak solution of willow bark powder, the closest thing she had to proper medicine. "What does her name mean?" Nalnish's stern expression softened. "Ayana means eternal blossom in our tongue. Her mother chose it because she was born in spring when the desert briefly blooms." His voice carried old pain. "Her mother died when Ayana was 4. Soldiers attacked our winter camp. Many died." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. She'd heard about that raid from Captain Morrison, how his men had struck a hostile Apache encampment and claimed victory. The newspapers had celebrated the death of 15 warriors. They never mentioned the women and children who also died. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, meaning it. "The desert takes much from all of us," Nalnish replied, his gaze fixing on something beyond the window. "Your husband, how did he die?" The question was delivered matter-of-factly, without the usual hesitation Whites showed when approaching her grief. Sarah appreciated the directness. "Cave in at the copper mine. He and 6 other men. They dug for 3 days trying to reach them, but—" She shrugged, the gesture hiding years of pain. They worked together in companionable silence as the afternoon wore on. Nalnish proved surprisingly helpful, anticipating Sarah's needs and following her instructions without question. When Ayana stirred and tried to speak, he would translate, his voice tender as he spoke to his daughter in their native tongue. As evening approached, Ayana's fever finally began to break. The crisis passed gradually. First her breathing eased, then the terrible heat left her skin, and finally she opened her eyes with something approaching awareness. She whispered to her father. "I'm thirsty." Sarah felt a profound relief as Nalnish helped his daughter drink. The immediate danger was past, though the child would need several days to fully recover her strength. "Thank you," Nalnish said to Sarah, his formal demeanor cracking to reveal genuine gratitude. "You have given me back my daughter's life." "She's not out of danger yet," Sarah warned, though she allowed herself a small smile. "She needs food, rest, and time to regain her strength. That fever took a lot out of her." As if summoned by the mention of food, Ayana's stomach growled audibly. Sarah laughed, the first genuine laughter she'd felt in months. "I think that's a good sign. Let me see what I can make for her." Sarah prepared a simple broth from dried beef and vegetables, careful to keep it light enough for a recovering stomach. As she cooked, she became aware of Nalnish studying her small living space, the lonely single plate at the table, the unused bed in the corner, the stark efficiency of a life lived without expectation of company. "You live alone here," he observed. It wasn't a question. "Safer that way," Sarah replied, stirring the broth. "People in town think I'm crazy for staying out here. Maybe they're right." "No," Nalnish said firmly. "This is a good place. Clean water, high ground, good sightlines. You chose well for defense." He paused. "But it is a lonely place for a woman to live." Sarah glanced at him, surprised by the insight. "What about you? Do you have other children?" "Ayana is my only child. Her mother and I. We were not blessed with others before the soldiers came." His expression grew distant. "In our band, children belong to everyone. There are always aunts and grandmothers to help. Out here, with just the 2 of us." He trailed off, but Sarah understood. The broth was ready, and together they helped Ayana eat small spoonfuls. The child's appetite was encouraging, though she tired quickly. As full darkness settled over the desert, Sarah faced a new dilemma. "You can't travel at night with her," she said, stating the obvious. "She needs rest." Nalnish nodded grimly. "I know, but staying here puts you in danger. If soldiers come, then we'll deal with that when it happens," Sarah interrupted. "Right now your daughter needs healing more than we need to worry about what might occur." As she prepared sleeping arrangements, Sarah realized how much her world had shifted in the course of a single day. This morning, she'd been a bitter widow, hiding from life's disappointments. Tonight she was harboring an Apache warrior and his child, offering comfort to people she'd been taught to fear. Outside, coyotes began their evening song, their voices echoing across the vast desert. Inside the trading post, 3 unlikely companions settled in for the night, bound together by circumstance and the fragile hope that tomorrow would bring them one step closer to safety. Dawn brought unwelcome visitors to Sarah's peaceful desert refuge. She woke to the sound of Nalnish moving silently through the trading post, checking the windows with the practiced caution of a man who had survived countless dangers. His alertness immediately set her on edge. "Riders," he whispered, pointing toward the eastern ridge. 6 men moving fast." Sarah grabbed her spyglass and climbed to her lookout position on the roof. Through the lens, she could make out a cavalry patrol led by Captain Morrison himself, their blue uniforms stark against the morning desert. Behind them rode 2 civilians she recognized, Tom Bradley and Jake Hutchins from Cedar Ridge, both men known for their hatred of anything Apache. "They're tracking us," Nalnish said when she climbed down to report. His face had returned to the stoic mask she'd first encountered, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Someone must have seen the smoke from your cooking fire." Inside, little Ayana was awake and alert for the first time since her fever broke. The child's recovery had been remarkable. Children were resilient in ways that amazed Sarah, but she was still far too weak for hard travel. The timing couldn't have been worse. "How long before they reach us?" Sarah asked, checking her rifle and counting ammunition. "Perhaps 1 hour," Nalnish replied. He knelt beside his daughter, speaking to her in rapid Apache. Ayana's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded bravely. "She understands we may have to run," he explained to Sarah, "but she cannot travel far, not yet." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The desert offered little cover between here and the mountains, where Nalnish's brother waited. A healthy man might outrun the patrol, but not while carrying a sick child. And if they were caught together, the consequences would be deadly for all of them. "There's another way," she said slowly, an idea forming. "You and Ayana hide in the root cellar behind the trading post. It's hidden under a false floor. Even if they search, they might not find it. I'll tell them I haven't seen any Apache." Nalnish shook his head firmly. "They will not believe you, and if they find us, you will hang beside me." "Maybe," Sarah admitted, "but it's better than watching your daughter die in the desert, because she's too weak to run." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of cavalry equipment and the low voices of men who believed they were closing in on their quarry. Sarah had perhaps 10 minutes before they arrived. "Please," she said to Nalnish, "trust me, I know these men. They're not looking for a fight, just following orders. If I can convince them there's nothing here." Nalnish studied her face for a long moment, weighing her words against years of experience with white deception. Finally, he nodded. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," Sarah interrupted, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. They moved quickly to prepare the deception. Sarah swept away any obvious signs of Apache presence, while Nalnish gathered their few possessions. The root cellar was cramped and airless, dug into the hard-packed earth beneath the trading post's rear wall, but it was well concealed and had saved her supplies from raiders before. "Remember," Sarah whispered as Nalnish lifted Ayana into the hiding place, "no matter what you hear, don't come out until I give the all-clear, even if it sounds like I'm in trouble." Ayana looked up at Sarah with those huge dark eyes and whispered, "Thank you, White Mother." The simple phrase hit Sarah like a physical blow. She knelt and gently touched the child's face. "Be brave, little one. This will be over soon." As the false floor slid back into place, Sarah heard the cavalry patrol riding into her yard. She quickly smoothed her hair, checked that her clothes showed no obvious signs of Apache presence, and stepped onto her porch with what she hoped was a welcoming expression. "Captain Morrison," she called out, recognizing the grizzled officer leading the group. "What brings you out this way so early?" Morrison dismounted, his weathered face serious. Behind him, Bradley and Hutchins remained mounted, their hands resting on their weapon belts. The other 3 soldiers spread out slightly, professional in their positioning. "Morning, Mrs. McKenzie," Morrison replied, touching the brim of his hat. "We're tracking Apache sign, a warrior and a child moving north. Trail leads right past your place." "Apache?" Sarah injected just the right amount of alarm into her voice. "I haven't seen anyone." "When was this?" "Yesterday, maybe the day before," Bradley interjected, his suspicious gaze sweeping the trading post. "We found their camp about 10 miles south. Cold fire, but recent." Morrison studied Sarah's face carefully. "You sure you haven't seen anything unusual? Smoke signals? Movement on the horizon? Anything that might indicate hostile presence?" "Nothing," Sarah replied firmly. "Just the usual. Miners heading north to the copper claims, that freight wagon from Tucson 2 days back. You know how it is out here, Captain. If there were Apache around, I'd be the first to know." "Mind if we look around?" Hutchins asked, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a request, just to be thorough. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she managed a casual shrug. "Of course, though I think you'll find it's just me and a lot of empty desert." The soldiers conducted a professional search, while Bradley and Hutchins poked around with the enthusiasm of men hoping to find evidence of savagery. They checked the trading post interior, the outbuildings, even the roof where Sarah kept her lookout position. Several times boots passed directly over the hidden cellar, but the concealment held. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, Morrison called his men back together. "Trail heads north," he announced. "They probably kept moving, trying to reach the mountains before we caught up. Could be anywhere by now," one of the soldiers observed. Bradley spat in the dust, clearly disappointed. "Should have brought the Apache scouts, they'd have found something." As the patrol prepared to leave, Morrison lingered for a moment. "You be careful out here, Mrs. McKenzie. This Apache has been moving fast and smart. If he's desperate enough to travel with a sick child, he might try anything." "I'll keep my rifle handy," Sarah promised. She watched from her porch as the cavalry patrol rode north, following the false trail that would lead them deeper into empty desert. Only when they disappeared completely over the northern ridge did she dare to breathe normally again. "All clear," she called softly, helping Nalnish and Ayana emerge from their cramped hiding place. Ayana was pale and shaky from the ordeal, but she managed a weak smile. "We fooled them, White Mother." Nalnish met Sarah's eyes with something approaching awe. "You risked your life for us. Why?" Sarah looked at the small family she'd protected, thinking of all the reasons she could give. Loneliness, compassion, simple human decency. Instead, she chose honesty. "Because you're not my enemies," she said simply. "You're just people trying to survive, same as me." 3 days after the cavalry patrol's visit, Ayana had recovered enough strength to travel. Her fever was completely gone, replaced by the natural energy of a healthy child, though she remained thinner than she should be. Sarah had spent those precious days feeding her carefully, building up her stamina for the journey that lay ahead. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp desert air that promised a scorching afternoon. Sarah had risen before dawn to prepare supplies for their journey: dried meat, hardtack, and most importantly, 2 full water skins that would see them safely to the mountains where Nalnish's brother waited. "You give too much," Nalnish protested, as Sarah added a small pouch of silver coins to their provisions. "We cannot repay such kindness." "I'm not asking for repayment," Sarah replied, checking the bindings on the water skins one final time. "Just, if you ever encounter another lost traveler, maybe you'll remember that not all differences have to end in blood." Ayana had been unusually quiet throughout their preparations, clinging close to Sarah with the attachment children form quickly in times of crisis. When Sarah knelt to say goodbye, the little girl threw her arms around her neck with fierce desperation. "Don't want to leave, White Mother," she whispered in her careful English. "Want to stay with you." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion she hadn't expected. Over the past few days, she'd found herself thinking less about the child she'd lost and more about the vibrant little girl who had brought unexpected joy back into her lonely existence. Ayana's laughter during their quiet evenings, her endless questions about the trading post, her gentle way of helping with simple chores, all of it had awakened something in Sarah she'd thought permanently buried. "I know, Little Blossom," Sarah said, using the English translation of Ayana's name, "but your father needs to get you somewhere safe, with your family. They're probably very worried about you." "Will we see you again?" Ayana asked, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. Sarah glanced at Nalnish, who was watching the exchange with carefully controlled emotion. They both knew the answer. Their peoples were locked in a cycle of violence that made future meetings unlikely, perhaps impossible. But looking into the child's hopeful face, Sarah couldn't bring herself to destroy that hope. "The desert is vast, but it has a way of bringing people together when they need each other most," she said instead. "Maybe someday." Nalnish approached them, his traveling pack secure on his shoulders. Over the past few days, he'd shared more of himself, stories of his childhood, his hopes for Ayana's future, his grief for the traditional Apache way of life that was disappearing under pressure from white expansion. Sarah had found herself drawn to his quiet dignity and the fierce love he showed for his daughter. "Sarah McKenzie," he said formally, "I will not forget what you have done. My daughter lives because of your courage and kindness. This debt will be remembered by my family and by my family's children." "There's no debt," Sarah insisted. "We helped each other. That's what people do." Nalnish smiled slightly at her stubborn refusal to accept gratitude. "In Apache tradition, when someone saves a life, they become family. You are now sister to my clan, protector of my daughter. If you ever need help, if the desert becomes too harsh or enemies too many, seek out the band of Cochise's nephew in the Dragoon Mountains. Tell them Nalnish sent you. They will give you sanctuary." The formal adoption into his family moved Sarah more than she could express. After years of isolation, of being the strange widow woman who lived alone in the desert, she was being welcomed into a community, even one she might never see again. As they prepared for the final goodbye, a dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. All 3 of them tensed, but Sarah's spyglass revealed only a freight wagon making its way toward Tucson. No threat, but a reminder that their time for private farewells was limited. "Go," Sarah urged. "Use the rocky ground to the north. It'll hide your tracks until you reach the foothills." Nalnish lifted Ayana onto his shoulders, the child's arms wrapped securely around his neck. She looked back at Sarah with an expression far too solemn for her age, as if she understood the gravity of this moment. "Goodbye, White Mother," she called, as her father began walking toward the mountains. "Remember, Ayana?" "I will," Sarah called back, her voice catching. "Be safe, Little Blossom." She watched them until they disappeared into the maze of rocks and canyons that led toward the high country. Even after they were gone, she remained on her porch, staring at the empty landscape that somehow felt different now, less hostile, more connected to the wider world of human experience. That evening, as Sarah sat in her rocking chair watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The trading post felt different, not empty but expectant, as if it was waiting for the next opportunity to shelter travelers in need. She'd proven something to herself over these past days, something important. She wasn't just the bitter widow hiding from life's disappointments. She was still capable of courage, of compassion, of choosing hope over fear when it mattered most. 2 weeks later, an Apache brave appeared at her trading post, not Nalnish, but a younger man who spoke careful English and carried a message. Nalnish and Ayana had reached his brother's band safely. The child was thriving in the mountain camps, and her father had shared the story of the white woman who chose kindness over fear. The brave also brought a gift, a small beaded necklace that Ayana had made herself, worked in the pattern of desert blossoms. With it came a message, "For my white mother, so she will not forget Ayana," as if she ever could. Sarah hung the necklace in her kitchen window, where it caught the morning light and reminded her daily that bridges could be built between any peoples if someone was brave enough to extend their hand first. The desert was still harsh, still dangerous, still unforgiving to the unprepared, but it was no longer quite so lonely. In the months that followed, other travelers found their way to Sarah's door, some white, some Mexican, some Apache. Word had spread quietly through the networks of survival that connected all desert dwellers. The widow woman at the trading post was fair, trustworthy, and would help anyone in genuine need. Sarah McKenzie had found her purpose again, not in hiding from the world, but in becoming a bridge between worlds. And sometimes late at night, when the coyotes sang and the stars burned bright in the clear desert air, she could swear she heard the distant laughter of a little Apache girl carried on the wind from the mountains where the eternal blossoms grew.